Welcome, everyone. We're ready to start our forum. Thank you all for coming to Emerging Visions for the Boardman River. My name is Tom White. I'm one of the board members of the Brook Trout Coalition, also a member of the Adams chapter of Trout Unlimited. I would like to open the evening with a big thank you to our Native American friends who have been so gracious and generous in sharing this wonderful resource that's the Boardman River with us for the better part of 2 centuries. I'd also like to thank the Brook Trout Coalition and the Adams chapter of Trout Unlimited for co-sponsoring this event. I would further like to thank Christine Crispin, Brett Fessel, Mike Vickery, and Steve Largent, our panelists this evening, and also Peter Payette, our moderator. I'd especially like to give a tip of the hat to Steve Largent, who gave birth to this idea at the Adams Fly Festival several months ago. He planted the bug in my ear, and it's grown from there. So I hope you all learned something tonight. The point of the evening is to generate light and not heat. We're trying to inform the public of evolving plans, and it's not really a place for debate tonight, but for learning. So please keep that in mind.
Bonjour. I just kind of happened to hear about this actually today, and I wasn't really sure what it was all about, but I've been very interested in the Boardman River, I guess, for a few thousand years. So anyhow, kind of what I wanted to talk about quickly is the Anishinaabe and this watershed that we're talking about. I was hearing so many of the different stories that everybody has, because there's so many relationships to this spot. And there was a lot of arguments back and forth about taking it out, leaving it in, and a lot of people didn't want to take it out. Well, suddenly, through all the processes, most of the dams are out. And what I've seen now is suddenly it has brought in incredibly more interest in this river than there was just a while ago before the dams came out. Suddenly it's super important. Well, let me take you back a little ways. In 1830, that was when President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. And so for 6 years, the Anishinaabe in this region were running and hiding and being removed out of here to Indian country, which is somewhere else for us. And so anyhow, in 1836, with our backs against the wall, we signed a Treaty of Washington and ceded our land here. Well, for thousands of years, this watershed, the archaeologists can tell you that there's 2 major trails that come into this watershed on each side of it. There's one up near Turtle Creek, comes in from that way for the south. There's another one that comes in through near Music and comes in on the west side of the watershed. So you can imagine with that watershed, when it was a real live place before it was butchered by the loggers, it sustained a lot of people traveling, coming up here. And that was 2 main trails that a lot of Anishinaabe used to come to different places for the summer. So with that in mind, it shows you how important it was just to us. And now suddenly it is important to lots of people. We've got brook trouters, we've got this, we've got that. Sadly, I don't see tons of tribal people. You know, I'm dismayed. We should have this room filled up with my people interested in this, but we don't. But one thing I can tell you is this river's at a junction right now where I was fortunate to travel to New Zealand and was hosted by some beautiful Maori people there. And while I was there, I found out that their world changed. Our world changed here in 1836. Their world changed in 1840. 4 years difference. That's when they ceded their land to the crown in England. So opposite sides of the planet, same thing was happening to our environments. So when I was there visiting with the people, they showed us where they lived before the dams. All of their major rivers, which were their lifeblood, there are all dammed up now. And when they'd heard that we were part of a dam removal here, they couldn't believe it, that a native people were actually part of seeing such a thing happen, because it destroyed their way of life there. And they are now told that those dams, you know, in there, I don't know how many generations those dams are there, and they can't do a damn thing about it. So we're here now at the junction of where this thing is coming alive, as everybody sees, you know. So let's just think about the river and not our own individual parts of it, and understand that this water that comes through here goes out and can flow all the way clear to our people over there in New Zealand. So think about how important that water is, and that it's not just for us. That water, when it flows out, it's for them too. So let's, you know, as we fight our way through this, let's do it with style, okay, folks?
Okay, why don't we start, as we think about the river, with a question about threats. What are the threats you are most concerned about in the Boardman River, the watershed or the river itself?
I guess is this working? Is this okay? Can you hear me? I guess I would use the word risk more than threat. I think there are, it's okay to call them threats, but I tend to think of the risks that we face if we fail to do what needs to be done to recognize the pressures that are building in a couple of important ways. One of them is somewhat, I think, obvious to many, and that is the continuing pressure to develop and commodify and use the river for commercial purposes. That is for private interests to start to put, to make it difficult for public interest in the water to be protected and served. So I think the pressure, I mean, in a simple word, is that we're struggling to balance the pressure for what I would call conventional development against the mandate, the obligation, the duty to respect and protect and transfer the river to those who come after us. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, this is sort of a little bit bigger perspective than the river only, but water in general. I think the risk we have is that we will not recognize soon enough just how much pressure is coming to us because of where we live for that water that we can in some way take for granted. So I really worry that the big risk, the biggest threat we face is failure to recognize just what kind of world is coming with respect to the demand for water. And how we use it is important. but the fact that maybe billions of people want it is maybe even more important. So that's what I worry about.
I guess what I see right now on more of a local, that's great, Michael. On a local, I see immediate need for balance of recreational uses, because the competing uses on the river are real, and we need to now, with the dams being removed, we need to balance the uses that we have. So a recreation plan, and people have heard me say this over and over, but we do need a well put together recreation plan that balances the recreational uses with the ecological health of the river.
Who would make a plan like that?
The community would. I think you would have to have have it led by an independent, group. But I think we come in to hear all sides of the issues, and then we can form a plan, from there. But to allow it to just go without any type of planning is just kicking it down the road, kicking the can down the road, the issue down the road. We need to address that issue.
But when you say the community, in like through what agency?
I don't know if there could be necessarily an agency. It could be through the Watershed Center, it could be through the Conservation District, it could be through, independent source. But I would see, that's just, hiring a consultant, bringing everybody, all interest groups together, and to talk about this issue, and to talk about, okay, how many canoes, kayaks, tubes do we allow in the river? At what time do fishermen, get in? And what's their time? How do we balance all these different uses?
Let's let the panelists finish, and then we'll get this man the microphone. Threats or risks, Brett or Christine?
Well, Steve and Michael covered a lot, said a lot. A lot of things that I would share. And I think the one thing that comes to my mind is been involved for long enough anyways, and we do taking a lot of efforts to plan and figure out these things, engaging the public, sometimes not as good as we should.
You got to get on that mic.
Gonna go New York subway.
Right. So yeah, a lot of planning efforts, and I've heard many times how much planning is it going to take, and I think the important part, we talked about this today, is the question why. Why do we endeavor on these things? And what kind of brings it home to me is it speaks to Michael's and Steve's concerns over how we've treated the river and how humans in general have treated waterways through history, tending to be just flowways for extractive purposes, and taking advantage of or exploiting. Those words come to mind. And so the community has really done a great job in helping everybody work towards a connected and more healthy system. And I would be concerned that we fall back into the same kind of mindset, and we forget within the next 20 years and forget all about what everybody set out to do here. Return to an extractive kind of mindset. So, yeah.
Thank you. Christine?
I don't necessarily have anything additional to say, sort of just to reiterate, when we're talking about balance, really understanding from my point of view that the water holds the priority, and we need to balance everything else against that. So if we are looking at water as the key, the thing we should be making decisions around, where we need to balance is how everything else could potentially impact that water. So from a water quality perspective, there's plenty of threats. Sediments, nutrients, shoreline erosion, invasive species, all kinds of things that threaten water quality in particular. But it's the understanding of how all of those things interact with each other and recognizing the watershed on a system scale and not looking at necessarily individual points, while those might be important, understanding how all of those things fit together in a bigger picture, and that every decision that is made has an impact on something else. So if you're saying yes to something, what are you saying no to? And from my perspective, we should always be saying yes to the water. And how do we balance the rest of the decisions that we make that water always stays protected?
Here in the front.
So my question is sort of about morals and ethics and use of the water. And specifically, I'll use kayaking, which is a fairly recent phenomenon. And the abuses that have been going on, not only on the Boardman in the area of Traverse City, but apparently all the rivers around Cadillac and whatever. And what bothers me is with the use of the internet, individuals to make money can organize events, use public landings to dump literally hundreds of people in waves for the purpose of doing nothing more than having a party. And I grew up doing that. I think everybody in here has probably had a drink going flow down the slab. Now what's different is the organized number, and they become a flotilla of drunks. And so the question is, and I honestly don't know the answer, but I'll start with the question of who has the authority to stop them, and how do they go about doing that? It may be townships, it may be cities, it may be the federal government in some cases, but the only way I can see it is to have some kind of jurisdictional control and stop that kind of behavior where it enters the water, the landings or whatever. And I was stunned last spring, I believe it was, when I think it was the federal government was going to try to stop that kind of behavior, and they were going to implement a bunch of things like the Pure Marquette River, rivers down by Cadillac, and they got email bombed. There wasn't a meeting where a couple hundred or a couple thousand avid kayakers showed up and wanted to defend their right to use the river. Think about it like this, a couple of college kids probably got 2,000 of their friends to email everybody on their email list, and everybody hit send at once, and they scared the crap out of the government that was trying to do what I think is the correct thing. Control something is a bad behavior. It's changing the nature of the use of the river using a mob mentality. Think about the sandbar fight at Torch Lake. I mean, it may be generational, but it's happening, and the only way you could control it is through local governments, and they're part of the river where they control the use of the land. Thank you.
Let's ask about control and what's possible.
Okay, I can start with that. Again, that's where we need the rec plan, but also it's each one of those owners of those access points, so the landings and the landing areas. So they control right now. The city by permit allows for only by permit commercial group activity. The state at the Forks and Checks and Shumsky are not giving out permits for commercial use at this time. So, again, that's part of what would be addressed in a recreation plan, but you're exactly right, Rick.
But he's raising an interesting question that it's not just about commercial operators, it's about anybody who wants to organize an event in this day and age can put a large number of people on a river if they can get their own flotations out there.
That's right, and again, that's one of the questions that would have to be addressed, and there's no easy answer.
So, if I may, occurred to me, kind of knew it was coming, but there's going to be questions posed nobody can answer today. Nobody can possibly answer. But I think in the spirit of how we've gotten here, one activity, one thing we did was make sure that we captured all those questions, that they were on the record, so that can inform a process moving forward to figure out the answer to those questions, to develop whatever mechanisms, whatever things we need to do, or we all need to do to address that. So I don't know if anybody's capturing these, or, I mean, obviously it's being
Capturing this
recorded.
meeting, yeah, it
The
is.
questions.
But I mean, the questions themselves.
Got a lot of them.
Okay.
I want to bring this question to Mike and Christine, because you've both raised issues of water quality and public trust of water. Is there any evidence that what goes on the Lower Platte or on the Pine damages the resource? Can the federal government or anyone who wants to curtail that kind of use point to 1,000 rowdy drunks and degradation of the watershed or anything below it?
Are you an expert about that?
No. I only cover the Grand Traverse Bay watershed, so I don't know.
Well, what would be the metric that would be used to determine what kind of harm had been done, right? And it'd have to be a harm that was under the jurisdiction of an authority to manage, right? There's an eyeball test. If you have hundreds of people wired together in a floating pod, then that looks like a lot of people, and it looks like it, and it may sound loud, and so there's sort of sense data about whether it's desirable or not, but those people have a right to use the river. The water is not ours. The land that they use to get to the river and get out of the river is not ours. It could be public land, and if they have authority to get to access to the river through a public landing or a dock or whatever, they're not doing anything wrong using the river in that way. Their behavior may be offensive, it may be problematic, it may be objectionable, it may even be at some point something that people want to curtail or in other ways alter. But the ability and authority to do that is a very difficult thing when we hold the water itself to be public and the land, even public land, to be usable as the public so deems. And if the public agrees with one approach, so be it. If they don't, then so be it. I don't know about the literal harm to the quality of water is a matter that I think, Clean Water Act, people authorized under the Clean Water Act would have to be invoked there, and I don't know. About that. I don't know if anybody monitors that sort of thing.
I do actually.
Others
I
might.
can comment. This brings up a question that I think we've been grappling with for a while. Excuse me, which is when we talk about the health of the river, we've been talking about this a lot lately for the Lower Boardman in particular. And we keep saying we want to do things that are healthy for the river. What do we really mean? This is a question I'm sort of throwing to all of us because this is something I think we all struggle with. You can measure specific things. You can measure how much trash gets thrown in a river. You can measure how much erosion is happening. But when do you consider it healthy? When you've met certain standards that who sets? And so I think when we talk about trying to preserve the health of the river and sort of setting what we consider, how many kayaks is too many? If you have 30 at a time, is that fine? But that 31st one really is detrimental to the health of the river. I think it's a good question that we need to address as we go through looking at different recreational aspects and how we're using the river is what standard are we trying to set for what we consider a healthy, functioning river? And then plan and think around that, right? Set some sort of ideals, goals. I'm not sure what it is, knowing that every individual action that we have along a river impacts that water in some way. We need to grapple, I think, a little bit with that bigger question of, If we want a healthy river and a healthy watershed, what does that really mean?
Can I just also say that what's important about this is that question of balance again. So while it's true that people, no one can restrict us from the water that's held in trust for us, the use of that water has to be balanced against other people's right to it as well. And the recreational use of water is not just kayaking. There's other recreational uses of water. So when those two conflict, they have to be balanced and sorted out. But those aren't the only uses either. I mean, it's all to use the water as a source of spiritual inspiration, for quiet time, for aesthetic for aesthetic enjoyment. Those are also uses of the river. And those have to be balanced as well. So the people who want to promote increasing uses of the river of one sort are just as obligated to find ways to balance that use against other legitimate and protected uses as we are, to try to find ways to keep that from becoming something we don't like. So there's a kind of a tendency toward thinking about how to control it and regulate it and tamp it down. But the other thing is to invite people who are using the water in one way or another to take responsibility for the fact that they are obligated to share that water with other people for also protected uses that may not be the ones they prefer. And I'm a trout fisherman, I like to stand in the river and fling around a fly line. And fly fishermen and canoers and kayakers have to work it out all the time. Right?
Let's go right here with the microphone in the audience.
Yeah, I come from a recreational standpoint. As a recreational professional, long history in the outdoor
keep that
recreation
mic up?
sports. Water does hold the balance, and I think we have that all in concern. What we need to think about here is also that humans have the power to maintain that balance. And whereas we're discussing here today, we're looking at all various aspects of water quality, habitat improvement, fisheries, shoreline riparian zones, and recreation and the human use of the river as well. I would just like to advocate that when we move forward with the Boardman River, we have a new river. And one aspect that has not been brought up yet is the fact that the Boardman River, as its new aspect with the dams gone now, is actually 3 separate rivers from a recreational point of view and a safety point of view. The upper portion from Brown Bridge down is primarily the same river that it's always been. It flows slightly faster and colder than it had before. But down to Beitner, after that, it did have a small rapids, but now it is a fast-flowing stream with Class 1, Class 2 rapids, which require guidance, escorts, and education for recreators to use. Now, there is an organization out there that is offering guided services that will provide safety and safe escort services through that section. But I think when we move forward with a recreation plan, we do need to look at it as 3 possible sections of river that do offer various and greatly different paddling abilities and safety concerns. That also transfers into the fishing aspect, but I'm talking from a paddling aspect. So I think when we move forward with a recreation plan, we do need to think solidly about finding a company that is willing to teach as they put people on the river. They're advocating safety, they're advocating education, and they're advocating protection of the river, and looking forward in a 7-generation mode that we can protect this river. We've restored the river back to its former glory, and it's healing itself at this point. So I think if we choose a outdoor recreation commercial operation, we need to choose an operation that is conscientious and not creating that party atmosphere that I think a lot of former companies have done in the past.
You sound like you know a few things about this. Someone was asking if that is possible for whoever has the authority to be selecting commercial operators based on their willingness to enforce ethics and aesthetics. That's your card. So does it happen? I mean, can anyone point to a scheme on a river somewhere
I think by taking-
where
I
that?
think by taking a model that a lot of Western River, like the BLM and the National Forest Service for Western rivers and permitting process for commercial operations has proven, although controversial at times, productive. So possibly we could look at that and adapting it to this specific river in our community, because I think we do hold a responsibility, given that this is a tourism base, to bringing people into this area that want to experience the Boardman River and not overlove it and not become a drunk float that rivers such as the Platte have become. And creating a commercial operation, or finding a commercial operation that is willing to put people on the river in a responsible way, and even offering guided services, which will give an interpretive opportunity.
Okay, let's move on to some questions about development. How close, just how close can buildings get to the riverbank?
It depends on what natural river zone you're in and what township you're in, and it varies. You know, in the wild scenic part of the river, upstream from the former Brown Bridge Dam site on the main stem is a 150-foot setback, but that was implemented in 1976, and so anything before that was grandfathered in. And then on the tributaries, it's a 100-foot setback. And then you go down below the former Brown Bridge Dam site that's called the country scenic portion of the Natural Rivers program. And there's different setbacks there, I think 75-foot and then 50-foot on the tributaries. You get into town, and that's, you know, that's out the window. It's a whole different.
Yeah,
I'll let Michael and Christine
It's
take
an
care of that.
active debate.
Yeah, in town on Boardman Lake, it's a 50-foot setback. And then the river as it goes through Traverse City is anywhere from 25 to 10 feet.
Right.
And those are building setbacks. So,
Yeah, there are parking setbacks, building setbacks. There's the historical building sites that have already been developed, and those that have been developed since those sites that are set back in different ways. So that literally the zones are irregular for pragmatic reasons in some cases, but also because we just never have had a consistent, principle-driven setback model, which is what we're working on now, is trying to figure out a way to do zoning from a riparian district perspective. I mean, if we think of the water, the river as a district, what should be the rules that govern its use and the connection of the river to the land uses next to it. So that's evolving.
What-
But it's 10 to 25 at the moment.
What changes could you see coming out of that?
I think the movement is to make the, where possible, where there's literally enough space to do it, to make those setbacks bigger, wider.
In which sections of the river are you thinking of?
Well, again, that's why we break it down into different reaches, because those sections are very different. There's a lot of public land along the river. There's a lot of private land that's already been developed. Some of the land is 20 feet wide from concrete or pavement to the river. Some buildings are within 10, 15 feet of the river. So there's no one answer to that, Peter. It's very much a jigsaw puzzle. And I mean, I don't mean it's haphazard. It's just the zoning rules have been used as written. But we've never really had, it goes to the challenge we face, we've never really had a plan which took the river as the first interest. I mean, to be able to do what Gene Dorenzi has called this, turn the face of the city toward the river instead of away from it. And I love that phrase, but that action is going to be very difficult because we've had our back to the river for so long that there are a lot of footprints at the back door that it'll be very hard to erase and redirect in a different way. But that's the challenge. That's what we're trying to do.
Okay, this is a question with a comment about floodplains. It is, quote, unquote, legal to build in or on a floodplain. Is that a good idea? I think not, and it's signed by Tom Mayer. Can someone comment on what kind of construction we have going on in floodplains and what the impact is?
Well, again, in the upper part of the Boardman, you have to get an Eagle permit, Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy from the state, in order to build in a floodplain. So floodplain regulations, at least in the upper part of the Boardman, have stiffened, a little bit more over the years to protect those properties, those flood zones, in the upper part of the Boardman, yes, it's that's regulated. When you get down lower, then that becomes a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, you still have to have an Eagle permit to build in a floodplain. The prudent thing to do is recognize that you're building in a floodplain. There is an example of a development that I believe is still going in, where the concept was to put their lower level parking there and say it's okay if we recognize that this will flood from time to time and we have ways to deal with that flooding. But you have to have a permit to do it. If you check the boxes, you will get your permit, and it's really on the property owner to make the decisions about how much risk they're willing to take to build what they want to build in that floodplain.
Okay, we'll go to the microphone. Where is it?
It's right here. I
Go
do
ahead.
have a question about the current state of the river, and maybe this could change the tone a little bit. I'd like to hear from each of you what the recent successes have been, be it water quality, invertebrate population, fish populations. Get everybody excited about where the current state of the river is, and I feel like that excitement will help lead, the conservation of the lower Boardman if we know what's happening on the upper Boardman, et cetera, being zoning changes, the dams coming out, the Natural Rivers Act enforcement, et cetera. You probably each have your own example of something that's positively impacted the river and where it is, today.
Well, one quick, with the removal of Boardman or Brown Bridge Dam, we saw a 9.2 degree drop in the average July temperature pre-dam removal versus post-dam removal. So that alone will encourage, more brook trout, simply because brook trout can, tolerate colder or need colder water. And so we've seen actually a shift, from Brown Bridge Road right below the dam from what would have been probably a 90-10 distribution, 90% brown trout, 10% brook trout before the dam removal. Now we're at, Scott, you can answer this one. Scott Hinselman's over here at the DNR Fisheries, but I think we're closer to a 50-50. If not, brook trout is now taken over as far as the dominant species below. Does anybody know that for a fact? I believe that's what it is.
I think that's pretty close to true. Last couple of seasons, the numbers are starting to even out. Brook trout are taking advantage of that cold water, and habitat that probably favors them a little bit more over brown trout right now. So,
And then secondly, as we install phase 1 of large habitat wood in the former backwaters of Brown Bridge, and we're going to be putting in phase 2 of what we call large habitat wood this coming year in 2020. So we're trying to increase and improve that in-stream habitat as well as working along the banks.
I think I have I think you had filled out a card, just to remind you what the question was. What is the current status of the watershed? Water quality, aquatic organisms, and the general status of the stream. Stream bank status, thank you. Either of you three, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I was just going to say one other one is that the aquatic insect monitoring that we've done, and Nate, you can fill us in on that, I guess, if you would, as far as Brown Bridge, and the numbers are back up to the diversity in numbers as compared to a reference reach. Can you fill in?
Yeah, we had a definite downturn in the macroinvertebrate community after Brown Bridge came out catastrophically, and that has since turned around, and the health of the river is, as far as macroinvertebrates, is exceptional, and with the exception
Yeah.
of New Zealand mud snails, which in some instances make up 75% of the biomass in any given sample of macroinvertebrates. And Brian Keyes is here from the Asabel Institute, and he runs the outfit that actually does the surveys on an annual basis. And we have a 12 to 13 year data set, which is pretty good. It's not the best, but we have a decent data set for which to compare. So.
Yeah, the Asabel Institute, which Brian is with, they first noticed New Zealand mud snails back in 2012, I think it was. And of course, you can imagine New Zealand mud snails are invasive, non-native snails. And so fish will eat them, but then they fill up their stomachs. They don't get much nutrient value out of them, and then they'll actually pass these snails whole, and about 50% come out. They pass them alive, so they just get redistributed to a different part of the river system. So they're a big issue.
So, yeah, from my observations, try and holistically as possible, look at it from an ecological standpoint, and I think it's important to remember a few things when it comes to the river function. Three essential functions of the river, and that's to move water, move sediment, and move biological matter. That's organisms, bugs, wood, you name it. And clearly, we're seeing that dynamic equilibrium reestablish itself. I heard the question or the remark about the condition of the banks, and I think it's important to understand that the channel, as it was put in its original alignment in both, well, in Brown Bridge, Boardman, and Sabin, were designed such that we weren't looking for like a stable, this is where it's going to be into perpetuity. We located the original alignment of the channel to the best of the ability, knowing that rivers are dynamic, and again, they move sediment. So what happens through time after a system is engineered, so to speak, it settles into its own rhythm, and part of that rhythm is moving back and forth, occupying the floodplain on a regular basis, liberating sediments, depositing them in different locations down valley. We do still, as you can imagine, have a relatively low abundance of large wood in these former impoundments, and that's a function of forest age. There's no mature forest adjacent to the channel, so it takes time for that conveyor belt of large wood to be recruited into the channel. And so that gets to Steve's comment earlier about adding wood as habitat, which it serves as habitat in many different ways. Serves for cover, it serves for hydraulic influence to create bed form diversity, depth variability, drives depth in pools, and so forth, which all you fishermen understand and know that that's where you catch the fish. But I got to remind you too, it's not just about in the channel. We've talked about invertebrates, fish, and banks. So what I've seen, and then what I've also heard anecdotally, locally, are tremendous increases of avian populations that are within the riparian area at Brown Bridge through time. The small mammal populations. I don't know if any of you spent any time, certain you have, walked around out there, and if you recall the cracks between the mud that was in that impoundment, those are like little mazes and raceways for voles and field mice and everything, which attracts the avian predators and then the small mammals. And so, point being, it's as if a light switch was switched on for that functional ecology. And a lot of work has been done with passerines or bird surveys. The delta that's forming out in Boardman Lake. We have revegetation going on, and it is attracting an extraordinary number of shorebirds. Some we haven't seen around here before, and there are the inconveniences that you put out there, but it's important to understand that these are all natural functions, and that adding that diversity is key. And lastly, it takes time to monitor. We can't possibly monitor and evaluate every nuance and document it statistically and come up with, okay, we saw a 32% increase in brook trout, or reduction in any kind of contaminants or anything like that. So without time, right? It takes time. Some of these things, you have to look at the trends and not just compare two dots from one year to the next. So, but overall, it's unquestionable there's been improvement into the functional and ecological form of that river.
Mike, you used the term former glory about the river in your opening comments. What did you have in mind when you talked about restoring its former glory?
I was thinking more just as the river was once natural in the sense that it didn't have dams in it, but I mean, you also have to realize that before it had dams, it had logs in it. And so, I mean, I'm, don't push me too far on that. What I mean is that there is a sense in which that river is a thing. It's a living thing. I mean, Brett's comments are just terrific and reminding us of that, and that idea of the turning on that light switch and having that river start to function again like a river instead of a series of collected pools is a remarkable thing. And so what I'm thinking of is, in general, the general sense in which restoration is a virtuous activity here, in the sense of restoring that river to being a river. And I think that not only has that light switch turned on the ecological and hydrological system, but it's also turned on people's thinking about that river as part of the reason why we're here. The proposal to take out that fourth dam and build a new apparatus and facility in downtown Traverse City has reminded people that the river is in fact connected upstream and down, and it's got people thinking about the river as a whole. That's what's driving this whole thing. We're starting to realize we have a moment, a unique and precious moment that actually people all around the world are kind of watching to see what we do here. A real special moment to figure out what is our relationship with that river and restore it to a glory that perhaps, I think I also said that perhaps it never had. Maybe we haven't seen its best days yet, I hope.
So in full disclosure, Steve just slid me a note, and to correct my remark, it's life switch.
Christine, did you want to get in on this general health question? Okay, I think over here, though.
I'm Nate. I'm a biologist that works on the Boardman and other rivers in northwest lower Michigan. And to go back to Peter's question about empirical evidence of overuse by recreationalists, the Pine River is a river I work on, and try and get a permit to take your family canoeing down the Pine on a summer day. The liveries have them all tied up. You need a permit, but if you want to take your family, you're going to have a hell of a hard time getting one from the Forest Service, because the liveries are sending fleets of canoes downstream. And a lot of those paddlers are, or whatever they're doing, they're climbing up these very erodible sandy bluffs, and it's preventing those bluffs from revegetating and stabilizing and adding excess sediment to the river. So that is that's something we can look at and say, yes, overuse is impacting the water quality of the river. And that's my first thing. And then while we're talking about what we are concerned about as far as overuse of the river. The rivers in this area have been part of my life since I was a boy. I grew up here, and the rivers are where I went when I could. And the thing I like about rivers is when they don't have houses or second homes on them. And I'm a bit of a socialist when it comes to that, I guess. But I'm the crazy guy who feels like rivers are too special to build your house on and have it as a water feature in your backyard. Worse yet, when people build a house or a cottage and then leave it for half the year, and the rest of us who go out and look for an aesthetic experience on a river wind up paddling through a subdivision. So that is my biggest fear for the Boardman, is that with the real estate boom the way it is going on just regular cornfields and alfalfa fields, the bullseye is on the Boardman River and every other piece of waterfront that can be chopped up and built on. And that, in my mind, the river is a public trust resource, but as a member of the public, my enjoyment of my public trust resource is compromised by overdevelopment of residences. I rarely go from Garfield to Beitner because, why would you when you just paddled through Brown Bridge and it's just beautiful? There's nothing there. And I feel like riparian homeowners have a responsibility to protect the river they live on or vacation on, and it goes both ways. Partiers and canoes and tubes may annoy those folks, but at the same time, I've been paddling and I've seen TV sets and windows right next to the river I'm paddling on, or loud stereos, or whatever, mowed lawns right to the edge of the river. And I'll go back to what Steve, he laid out the various protections that the Boardman River has, but they're not enforced very well. If you go down the Boardman, you'll see mowed lawns, and there's one house that is built right next to the river, and it looks like a drive-in movie screen, and that's on the upper part of the river. So to me, somebody that loves rivers for what they are, overdevelopment is the biggest hazard. I paddle in the winter, so if there's a fleet of kayaks in the summer or spring, yeah, I'm going out in the winter. I don't care. There's not going to be a lot of those folks out there. So development is a permanent mark on the landscape, and it affects a lot more than just the biology and ecology of the riparian zone. So thanks.
Okay, if you'd like the microphone, get your hand up. I want to ask the panel, Nate brought up sediment. We have a couple questions about sediment, how much there is of it, if there's anything being done about it. Someone's asking specifically about silt at Logan's Landing. Someone else is connecting it to the development of the Tart Trail. I'm not quite sure how that relates, but could we hear about sediment and silt and what's being done, particularly at Logan's Landing and around Boardman Lake?
Well, Brett touched on that a little bit. That's going to be a natural emerging wetland in there, and it's ecologically it's going to become quite diverse with plant life and like that. So nothing is really going to be done about that silt there in Boardman Lake. But if you go back and you think about each one of those impoundments, Brown Bridge, Boardman, and Sabin impoundments, for the 100 years that those dams were in place, they captured sediment that would have been naturally moved downstream. Yes, much of it excess sediment, result of human activity, but all that sediment would have moved downstream without those dams in place, and where would all that sediment ended up is in Boardman Lake. Boardman Lake, before we were here during glacial times, up in that Logan's Landing area was always a depositional zone. And so those dams being in place for the 100 years that they were there captured that sediment, especially Brown Bridge and Boardman. And there was a fourth dam, Keystone Dam, that also during this time captured sediment. But we were able to then dredge out the original channel and find the original channel under all that sediment and then lock that sediment into place above the 100-year floodplain. So that sediment, which would have otherwise been down into Boardman Lake, has been locked in place in the upper parts of each of those impoundments. So yeah, sediment is a big issue. It continues to be a big issue since we're a sand-based ecology here, and it's why we have such cold, clear waters and rivers, lakes, and streams, is because our precipitation soaks into the ground, enters our rivers, lakes, and streams as cool groundwater, clean groundwater, and so that's what makes our rivers and waters so pristine. But it's also a double-edged sword. It's also highly erodible and ends up in our waterways, which then impacts the aquatic systems within the river.
So in terms of the human impact of sediment, there are a few things that we actively monitor. One being stream bank erosion sites. So every few years we go out and go through the entire watershed and look for identified sites where there might be issues and sort of prioritize them depending on how bad they are. Another piece would be road stream crossings and sediment that gets into the rivers through those and what the status of those road stream crossings are as well. So there is some active monitoring that happens on a regular basis to identify some of the human impacts or sites that are impacted sediment-wise due to human activity, and prioritizing those and trying to get funding to have those taken care of. So there's the natural flow and all of the sediment that's in the river naturally, but the human-caused sources of sediments are actively monitored and tried to be taken care of as quickly as we can.
Of those 600 erosion sites that I mentioned that we inventoried back in the early 90s, it was 80%, in my estimation, were the result of human activity in some way, shape, or form. So yes, sedimentation and sediment is very natural in a natural river, especially here in northern Michigan, but too much sediment does tip that scale. And the one thing, though, that we are going to stop doing is cleaning out these sand traps. We did have 4 sand traps on the Boardman, but after cleaning those out, which removed a lot of sand from the system, but the impact downstream as we cleaned out those traps, as we monitored the downstream impacts, and the cost of cleaning those out would be better to put it into habitat. And so that's what we're going to be doing, is putting more time and effort into restoring what Christine was just talking about, those active erosion sites, including road stream crossings, but also into more habitat and not into sand trap.
In the back with the microphone, Mike.
Thank you, Peter. You hear me? First, I'd like to thank Mr. Bailey for being the carrier of some ancient wisdom that I think we all need to be paying attention to. And I'm reminded that John Muir, the great naturalist, said that the grizzly bear existed for its own magnificent selfness, which is exactly why I think the Boardman exists. It's not an economic engine, it's a river, it's an entity unto itself. And we just need to be absolutely very careful with it. I'm surprised that one of the issues that wasn't mentioned has the potential to be a huge impact on the upper river, and that's the fish pass. It's a $17 million piece of concrete in the bottom of at the very beginning of the Boardman River. So I have a couple questions that I'd like to enter into the record. I don't know if you'll answer them now, or if you don't want to answer them, or if you don't feel like you're the people that need to answer these questions. But I do know there's a representative from the tribe here, and I expected a representative from the DNR here, and I wish somebody from the fish pass had been here. The first question is, why did the language of the fish pass group change from not allowing non-native species to allowing desirable non-native species. I wonder what desirable means. The second question, is the fish pass an experiment as it's advertised? I once got in an online discussion with somebody about the fish pass, and he was quick to point out that they weren't experimenting with the river, they were experimenting with technology. Well, we all know that technology fails eventually, and I wonder what they're really experimenting with, because everything they do there has the potential to impact the entire river system. I'm also curious to know if the entities here would support the fish pass if it meant the passage of non-native anadromous fish, potentially steelhead and salmon, up into the upper reaches of the river, where there's a beautiful, naturally reproducing group of brook trout. I'm also interested in how this impacts the public use doctrine, because if you can't impair or influence the water, it seems to me that that stands in direct contradiction to the Public Trust Act. $17 million of concrete is an impairment, and concrete to me is an invasive substance in the river. It doesn't belong there. I hope you'll take these questions into consideration, and thank you for doing this tonight. I have a lot of respect for the Brook Trout Coalition. You're doing some great work. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to the panel, and I think we have someone from the DNR here. If he wants to speak, we can get him a microphone as well. But does anyone here want to start in any of the areas that Mike laid out?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That is really a tough one. No, I mean it's something, a decision that's got to be made that's going to impact, again, the ecological, the environmental, and the spiritual part of the watershed, and so it can't be done lightly. And so I think there's a lot of discussion to go forth, but yeah.
Did I say there will be questions that can't be answered? So I appreciate those questions, and they resonate. I hear them a lot. And in part, I feel like we need to do a better job explaining why Fish Pass, why we're there, why we're here. And suffice it to say, it's a tool. It's a tool, and without consuming the rest of the evening, I would be more than happy to talk offline with you or anybody about this issue, this topic. And I think it's important to understand as well that there's at least a 10-year time frame of determining what tools work best. And keep in mind, it's not about the specific decisions, actions at that site. It's about defining fish community objectives, and those have not been defined. And that's up to the public, that's up to everybody to define fish community objectives. And so, as you can imagine, rumors and conjecture and everything fly everywhere. And especially when you talk about excitable issues, high-profile issues like fishery management. And if you remember that slide, those teachings, one of them's honesty, one's truth. I encourage you to seek the truth, and I think it'll help. Trust me, it'll help, and I'm willing to talk about it. We've got other representatives here that understand the history behind it.
But could I just ask, because both Steve and Brett, expressed there's a reluctance to talk about this issue. Why is that? I mean, People have differing opinions. Some want to see some fish up in the upper river, some don't. Why is this? And the other thing about this, it strikes me, is for 10 years we've been saying, well, these decisions are way out. It seems like it's never time to talk about it, but there's plenty of good questions Mike just asked that we could talk about. Regardless of when decisions are made. So help us understand the reluctance to just get it out in the open and talk about it in a civil way.
So there is 10 years of evaluation to go through to figure out what's going to work, what species are appropriate or determined by the public. And I think what's being lost on this is that there's this perception and expectation that once this facility is installed or developed, that immediately after construction, a switch is going to be flipped and this spectrum of fish species will be sent into the watershed. And nothing could be further from the truth. That reluctance to talk about it is knowing that this is such a hot topic and divisive issue that we need to take care and have this conversation and continue it and help people to find, get the truth about it. Because if there's a concern over what species are in this watershed, then express it. You're already doing it. I don't know what else to say over that, because it is not a management decision-making tool. It's a tool to help implement decisions.
What is a tool? The fish pass?
The facility. Now, keep in mind, the whole reason for a selective system to be put in place was the threat of sea lamprey on Great Lakes fisheries. Great Lakes Fishery Commission and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service essentially said you cannot take out lowermost dams because that would open the door for sea lamprey and increase production beyond their capacity to manage them and so on, and it would put the threat to the Great Lakes fisheries. That being said, we have to remember too, when we went through this whole process, there was a decision made over the dams in the Boardman River, and that decision made by the city and the county, the owners, and the implementation team was remove 3 dams, modify the last. And for a long time, nobody knew what modification looked like. Nobody knew what that was going to be. We just knew that it had to be modified, it could not be removed, okay? Because believe you me, myself and several others were like, let's roll the dice and take it out. Let's open this system up so you can have the volitional passage of native species, because those are really the ones that are excluded. Now that's a simplistic way of putting it, but that was, if we're going to really call this connected, that would be the end. The other side of that was leave it in place. Well, that doesn't achieve the goal of true restoration and reconnection. So the in-between, that magic sort of tool was the mystery. And quite honestly, you could imagine that you could have a selective system in place that could allow managers or communities to actually kind of pick and choose what species could be passing through. So held hostage basically by sea lamprey. There had to be some form of tool or mechanism that could allow for that flexibility. And it's a hard one. So if I were sitting up here 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, and a question came up, you're going to modify Union Street Dam. What does that mean, and what's that going to look like? I have no idea. I have no idea. Engineers can come up with some pretty amazing things, but what I could tell you is that it's not going to be gone. It would not be removed, and I could tell you that it's not going to stay. And that's where we are.
The other thing is that, we talked about the two things. One, whatever was in place for where Union Street Dam is has to maintain the level of Boardman Lake. Union Street Dam raises the level of Boardman Lake by 9 feet and adds about 80 acres of surface water to a natural occurring lake. And so you need to, because of the industry around, historic industry around Boardman Lake, if you exposed any of those sediments by dropping that lake 9 feet and exposing those 80 acres, you have to do something with those contaminated sediments. So you had to keep that lake level at its current level. Two is we had to block sea lamprey. And so those were the two must-dos. And in fact, Eric over here, standing against, well, we had you brought in an expert from Whitewater, Park that there was discussion about a whitewater park down there that blocked sea lamprey, that kept the level of Boardman Lake, but that didn't fly. And then there was, again, talk about, this Great Lakes Fishery Commission and looking at the lowermost barriers on not just the Boardman, but on all these Great Lakes tributaries. And so that's when it was selected out of how many different, 16 different rivers around the Great Lakes. And again, the experimentation that's going to go on, from my understanding, is going to be going on independent of allowing anything to pass upstream. So there's going to be able to maintain that blockage from any passage upstream. And so, but again, it's got to be 100%, effective, because if it's only 80% effective, it's 20% not effective. And then also, we have to look again. I said this from the very beginning. What fish, Great Lakes fish, we allow to pass is going to be more controversial than taking the dams out themselves. And so, what we need to do is as a community, make sure that the decision makers, being the DNR and the Grand Traverse Band, know what our values are. Again, it's going to change the whole ecological, cultural, and spiritual nature of the Upper Boardman, in some way, shape, or form. So just stay tuned.
Let's go to the back. All right, thank you, guys. I use the Boardman River 4 seasons, whether it's hunting, fishing, camping, trapping, canoeing, or kayaking. And very rarely have I had a disagreement or a bad run-in with regular river users, folks who are out there constantly. The things I see, whether it's the beer tree on the Upper Boardman, the 12 feet of erosion on the shoreline below Union Street Dam, is typically from those who aren't regular river users and don't necessarily get the full grasp of the Boardman Valley watershed. What are some things we can do as a community? I'd like to put that to the panel to educate those visiting the river. What sort of initiatives do you think might work?
Bigger bottle deposit? I don't. Yeah, there's messaging is tough. It's got to start I guess early age, and because some people just can't read. So there was talk about also potentially a tax on sporting goods such as kayaks and like that would go back into some type of a marketing promotion that would just for that reason, Corey. So yeah, it's a tough. We got to reach out, and it's not necessary. It is some people who live here, but it's mostly the people who don't own this area or don't feel ownership of the area.
Grant, go ahead.
Is this green? This here? Okay, thank you. Wanted to follow up on what Mike Delp had raised and then what Steve commented on. Here's the concern about fish pass just on a procedural level. I found the article from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission in May of this year in which it says what we need to research is, and it lists a number of alternatives to make fish pass screen and work and prevent the lamprey. And yet, when you stop and think that as of 3 months ago, they're just identifying potential things to research. What we want to do is trust you because you've done such a marvelous job upstream. I mean, you walk around that, my wife and I have been walking around that Boardman pond area this summer just obsessively. It's so stunning that I can't believe you would let any significant mistake happen. But looking and talking to the people at Great Lakes Fisheries, and Mayor Carruthers is here tonight, I know, and what the word on the street is, this decision is almost done, right? It's almost adopted. 65, the decision to build Fish Pass. There's a momentum among the partners, and they have disparate wishes about which fish to pass, and they're all agreed that they don't want lamprey going up, but they don't know how to do it, but they're going to build it. And then they're going to make the Boardman River a test tube. And so when is the point when you hear the click on the gun and you see some finger on the trigger, when do you cry, when do you cry alarm? That's the issue. I wish you could comment on, is the deal a done deal? Can we put the fire to make sure, especially lampreys don't go up, and then protecting the brook trout? Because the gentleman talked about the spirit, we're all involved in the spirit of the river, but it just seems it's going to change unless we speak up. But the time, when is the time to go back to Steve? You guys have done a masterful job on this river, but don't you see this as a fundamental threat? And when should we speak?
Are you, Grant, could you keep the microphone? Are you saying you think the Great Lakes Commission and Fish and Wildlife might get it wrong and lampreys would be spawning up in the upper Boardman?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And you know why? Because the other rivers, the things they've tried, haven't worked. Pere-Marquette, they had to take the electrical weir out. Grand River, they got a fish ladder down there, but they're still putting TFM. They're still putting the lampricide in the tributaries upriver from that. The question is, I don't know this. All you fish biologists are smiling like I'm a stoop, and I am. But I will admit that, but what I will ask you to say is, how do you know the lampreys are not going to piggyback onto fish that are going through whatever the screening process is? If you don't, there's been no selection of a screening process. Let's start there, right? Isn't that true?
Yeah, and could I just ask one clarification from Mike? So I thought when you kept referring to a $17 million piece of concrete, I thought you were suggesting the river should just flow naturally through the downtown.
Not at all.
Okay.
I'm saying that $17 million of concrete is called a fish pass. That's what it is. They want to pass fish. Well, what kind of fish do they want to pass? I was on the original dam removal committee a long time ago, and I went to the first meeting. And then I went to the second meeting, and there were 2 DNR representatives there who made no bones about the fact that they wanted anadromous fish in the upper parts of the Boardman River. And I'd like to know, I'd like to hear from the tribe and from the DNR if you have made a deal that we don't know about, that somewhere in the future you're just going to monkey around down there and then you're going to pass anadromous fish into the upper river. Have you made a deal, or are you, Brett, you talked about being honest and trustworthy. I want to know if there's been any discussion about doing that. And I think a lot of people in here would like to know that. Grant's, he speaks for himself. He's concerned about lamprey control and how you're going to do that.
No. There has been no deal made. Of a deal? No. There's no discussion over a deal or anything like that. So it's...
Okay. Where's the mic? Stuart.
We all know about estuaries and how productive estuaries are. And I think behind a lot of this discussion is that the Boardman River will feed will become a feeder to the Grand Traverse Bay. And I was wondering if any of you think that that's a real possibility, that we'll return to a natural ecosystem where small fish are raised and grow in the estuary, in the river, and move to the bay. And is there any possibility that that will happen? And if not, why are we building the fish pass?
Back to the questions that we can't answer. I couldn't answer that. And so why build fish pass? I go back to the consideration of whether the existing structure stays there or not. That decision was made, and that's the modification is the move forward on that. So.
Okay, if I can add to that,
Yeah.
early on in the discussion of whether or not to remove the dams, we were just talking about Brownbridge, Boardman, and Sabin dams. They were the hydroelectric dams. And I believe it was Richard Lewis, city manager at the time, because of the age of the Union Street dam, said, let's also throw Union Street in there because we got to do something about that at some point in time because of its condition. And so that's how actually Union Street dam got thrown into the dam removal mix, was because it was one of the lowermost barrier, which is one of your most critical dams, and just to leave it the way it was with the rotting boards and like that wasn't a good answer either. So again, we went through a whole bunch of different scenarios of whether it would be a whitewater park or what have you until the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission came in with this idea of fish pass facility, which is a state-of-the-art facility. And then from there, it's kind of grown into this, where the Boardman was selected out of 16 rivers. Now, again, not defending fish pass, but being part of watching this, it will have the ability to pass whatever or block whatever species. So like sea lamprey, whether it be whatever, it will have that ability to either block or pass that, and it's going to be up to the managers to determine, and the public talking to those managers. So
Which managers do you mean?
that would be the DNR and the Grand Traverse Band are the decision makers of what fish will.
And what if they don't agree?
I can't. That goes to Brett. I can't answer that one. No, if they don't agree. But no, the public has to speak up and speak loudly to the decision.
Not informed on what's going on, how can they speak up?
What do you think you're not informed about?
Yeah.
Let's just
Yeah. Yep.
So my name's Scott Heinzelman. I'm with.
let's give this man a microphone.
I'm not
Where's
loud
the-
enough.
no.
Hey, give him your mic.
So, is this on now?
Yeah.
So, the DNR was not invited to be part of the forum today, so that's part of the reason why I'm just sitting here on my hands, kind of listening to the comments and seeing how things go.
Just let him talk. He's
I can try. Can you hear me now? Okay. So also somebody probably representing the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission should be here to talk about fish pass. That would be very helpful right now to describe how the experimentation is going to go, the implementation, optimization of the structure. Brett and Steve nailed a lot of the, I think, the basics of the project. And it is absolutely the intent that it will pass fish both up and down in terms of smolts and reproduction of native species. The discussion about other species, desirable species, which are going to be your other migratory salmonids. I realize that maybe in this room everybody is very protective of the brook trout and brown trout population, the self-sustaining population that you have right now. I absolutely understand that. We have heard
from a lot of other folks that are interested in passage of other popular species that people like to fish for around the state. So, you know, as a governmental agency that oversees management of these fisheries, we listen to everybody. So, you know, that's just going to be part of the process. We're going to hear a little bit from everybody. In terms of the question about whether there's some deal or something that's already been made, as far as passage goes, we don't know what that's going to be at the end of the Fish Pass project. The idea is to build this structure, allow some of the brightest minds in fisheries management, fisheries passage from around the world to experiment on this river. Not on the river, but in this structure. Let me clarify that. Because the way the structure will be built, they can run their experiments, pass fish above those experiments with still another check in the system that won't allow fish to go truly upstream. They can only get past the design structure that's being experimented with in the experimental channel. So I would encourage anybody that's more interested to just simply get more informed. There's a lot of information out there, and the folks that work for the Great Lakes Fisheries Commission are more than willing to talk to anybody about all the details and any of the details about this project and where it's going to go.
Could I ask you one question, please? And I don't know if you can answer this. Originally, the project was supposedly, it was advertised that the tribe did not want to pass non-native species. Right. And the language got changed somewhere to desirable non-native species.
The tribe, the way I understand it, the tribe put out, the tribe presented their resolution that said that they clearly wish to pass native species. They didn't exclude other species in their resolution. They just said their priority and their interest is in native species. The state's interest is in all species and all, you know, what people desire. But none of this is a done deal or a preconceived plan. Sure, if you had DNR folks in the room early on in the planning process, they definitely talked about passing other migratory species. We are constantly asked to take dams out specifically for that reason, to pass migratory species in streams that would support amazing natural reproduction. That's going to be something that's going to come up. You're not going to skip over that. It doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen on the Boardman. There's a lot of other things that are being looked at on the Boardman right now. It's one of the streams that has the potential of grayling reintroduction down the road. So there's a lot of things that are going to be looked at. You're going to have lots of opportunities to be involved. And myself as the unit manager out of Cadillac, your local biologist, Heather, our basin coordinator, our chief, anybody will talk to you about fish passage, the facts about the Boardman River, you know, what we know, what we see in the surveys, the information that we have. There's some of the information out there is not completely accurate right now. So we just need to have open conversations about what we have in the river, how it's doing, what the potential is, and look at, you know, there's potential to do some experimentation with migratory species and learn a lot of things that we haven't really been able to do up to this point. I think Fish Pass kind of wound up on the Boardman because you already had an amazing project going on in this, you know, on this river. You're removing 3 hydro dams, restoring the river channel. It's a huge experiment, really, to see how it all works out, how the river revives, reconnects, and what the potential is. Fish Pass is just another piece of that is going to put the world spotlight on Traverse City. And it's an amazing educational opportunity. I mean, these were things that people identified that they were interested in. And it's always been kind of an innovative town. So, but
Okay, we're going to, Steve, thank you for stepping up.
Scott.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Scott. We'll go, if Rick, we can take one more question or comment about Fish Pass, and then I think we need to move on. Yes, you may. If we could bring him the microphone. Okay, we're going to have 2 more comments potentially on this issue.
Yeah, invasive species. Usually it's a word that connotates a negativity about the species that occurred there, which wasn't there naturally. That is the sea lamprey. And most people, I think, would agree that the sea lamprey is a negative invasive species, and we don't want it up the river. And hence, that's why the dam is there's a dam there at Union Street and should continue to be some kind of barrier like a dam. Now, I would also point out that the other invasive species, which is not so negative, but are steelhead and salmon and rainbow trout, and brown trout, if you will, too. Those are all invasive species. And that wants to be taken into consideration on the decisions of fish passage. And those decisions, and I think why most of us are here, we would like those decisions to be made on a community level, not down in Lansing.
Rick.
I'd like a comment that is sort of about the fish pass, but the plan is to remove the Union Street Dam, and the fish pass will be a little bit farther upstream from the current location of the dam. And one of the things that bugs the hell out of me is the projected cost to repair the Union Street Dam was about $800,000. And recently the city commission raised an administrative fee on city residents, I think mostly for sidewalks, and raises $200,000 a year. So if you quit putting it towards sidewalks, you could have the dam repaired if you wanted, point one. Point two is this would call for removal of Union Street Dam. Union Street Dam is a part of a city park. As a matter of fact, the dam is the feature of the city park. If you alter that, it requires a vote of 3/5 of the people, the city residents. So where this is going to end up is in court probably for 5 years.
There you go, Grant. I think so. I have one more question here. Does anyone on the panel want to get in on any of the conversation that just happened out here?
I would like to make to follow on a remark earlier over a reference to language with the Fishery Commission. I think I have some, this is correct, but language changing from the Fishery Commission's perspective in regards to desirable non-natives or something. So I am absolutely interested in seeing the language that you refer to, because I do, and I can tell you, I recall early on with the Lower Boardman leadership team, when asked to give a general presentation on fishery resources, fisheries, fish communities, you know, the kind of biology 101 in the Boardman, and I made a reference to desirable non-natives in the context of how fishery managers, DNR, so on, consider steelhead and salmon and other brown trout in the in reflection to native species and exotics. Okay, non-native, desirable non-natives is a distinction from exotic species or invasives. So all of a sudden, I make this reference, and all of a sudden, the next thing I know, I'm not on social media, so, but I learned that it's blowing up that the tribe is supporting desirable non-natives, and I'm like, okay, you know. So this is an example of, I think Scott brought it up. There's a lot of misinformation. There's just, you got to find. And so what I would have hoped to that would have occurred is whoever was, you know, throwing that out there to come to me, come to the tribe and ask. There's a resolution that the tribe had put forth that species native to the Great Lakes Basin only. that simple, you know, and that's where it sits. So I appreciate the concern and everything, but I don't, you know, sometimes, you know, I don't appreciate getting kind of just put out there like I'm lying, you know, as some of you have maybe suggested. So, thank you.
A comment I would make is that the discussion underscores for me the point I was trying to make in the outset, and that is that the decisions that are being made about the Boardman River in various locations impact not just those locations and the people imminently connected to them, those sites and problem, but they impact every other part of the river. Could not be better illustrated than by the discussion of the fish pass operation in the downtown reach of the lower Boardman River, which has meaning, implication, impact, and power on everyone who cares about the Boardman River and wishes to use it for whatever purpose, upstream and in town. The discussion of this facility continues to vex me because it seems like we're talking about things that should have been talked about long ago before the decision was ever made to rebuild the Union Street Dam in the way that it is apparently being rebuilt. But it wasn't. And so now we are faced with a discussion about making a plan to manage, implement, utilize, and gain the value of this facility in the middle of its being built. So there's a kind of a presumption in favor of the facility being built and a corresponding lack of clarity about what it will do and what impact it will have on the river as a whole. I know there's differences of opinion about that, and people want to say if you question the process that led to the decision to build Fish Pass, you're somehow against it, or you're somehow misunderstanding the science, or you don't have enough information. We have a lot of information. We have this facility being built in downtown Traverse City. What we don't have is a lot of information about what is going to happen when it is built, how it will be managed. We understand the organizations and agencies that have imminent and immediate decision-making authority, but we don't know what processes of decision-making will go forward and what role the public interest will have in those decisions, and how the concerns of not just people who live upstream and want to fish for brook trout. I think that caricature of what the concerns are is unfortunate. I think it's much deeper than that. I think it has to do with, a need to, there's a desire to trust the processes of decision making. There's a desire to believe that what we're doing is being done in the best interest of the overall health of the river and the public uses of that water by people who use it for all kinds of things in town and upstream. And that to me is the public trust challenge of our time, is how do we avoid further disruption of the trust necessary to collaboratively discuss and go forward. The river is almost to me a symbol. It is a fact, it is a thing, it is real, but it is also a symbol of what we face as a people, the incredible need we have to start getting our house in order as a family and a community of people who share and have a future stake in common resources, and to start acting like it. And that goes for the agencies and organizations that are responsible for making decisions, not just citizens, who have every right to have the opinions and feelings that they have, but they also have every duty and obligation to pursue those opinions with facts and try to figure things out. This just reminds me of how important this dialogue is, that this community is trying to get a picture of what it wants that river to become. And that picture is going to be very complicated, necessarily, by where we stand, what perspective we bring, and what our own interests are. But we have to balance our interests against all others. We have to find balance in all this. And that won't be won't make us all happy all the time, but we have to have faith in a process that does that. So I think this is a good thing. That's how I feel about it. Better we have it out now than
So
later.
no, I think we've got to wind this down. Christine, do you have any? Okay, I just have a general question. Well, Nate, you want to quickly?
I think it's very easy to be a skeptic. It's harder to be educated, and I would hope that folks would do their best to educate themselves about what the mission of Fish Pass is. We're trying to get sturgeon back into the upper Boardman River after the Union Street Dam was built in 1865. Sturgeon have not been able to access the upper river since that time. We're not just talking about steelhead and salmon. We're talking about walleye, pike, muskie, suckers, things, lake-derived nutrients that can go up into the upper river and add to the ecology of that river. And somebody's river has to be the one that takes it. Somebody's river somewhere has got to be the river that undergoes this process. And the dam removal project was predicated on connectivity of aquatic organisms. And this is part of that process. And I just hope that folks will just educate themselves, ask questions. We all have availed ourselves day and night to people to answer questions, and we're glad to do it.
And we can do it over a cookie after this, but I want to ask one question. So if I was interested in the fish passage, I would know to go to the DNR or the Great Lakes Commission. It's less clear to me if the traffic on the river was my concern, where I would even go to have an input into that. Can any of you help people who are interested in that topic, where they might go tomorrow?
Traffic on the river, meaning, I'm sorry.
Paddlers, just the increased usage of the river by various recreational interests.
As far as numbers, that's something that has to follow. But, paddlers, right now, the main thing is that, the locals and the visitors, are using the river and enjoying the river. And at this point, it's in the hottest summer, weekends that you see the river really crowded. So, right now, people need to get out and enjoy the river, float the river, experience the river with caution below Beitner. Just get out.
But if you want to have a say in how many people and how that happens and how those decisions are made, who's talking about that and making those decisions?
We have to find the monies to support a process. So in other words, the development of that recreation plan, we need to find the money. We went to the Coastal Management Program for a grant, and were turned down. We were told to reapply this year, so we're going to be doing that. We have a lot of partner groups as well that would be interested in contributing to such a development of such a plan. But that is something that, yes, it's going to be also a painful process, but we, again, become involved and stay involved, whether it be the recreational plan, whether it be the fish pass, whether it be, whatever, don't stop being involved.
Okay, great. Thank you to all four of our speakers tonight. And thanks to Tom White for putting all this together.